Today, I'm fortunate to be joined by Robert Suettinger, author of the new book, The Conscience of the Party, Hu Yaobang, China's Communist Reformer, that was published in October by Harvard University Press. And Bob has had a storied analytic career at the Central Intelligence Agency, including stints at the National Intelligence Council and the National Security Council. And he also developed a cult following among my generation of analysts because of his honesty about the challenges of assessing the Chinese Communist Party and his encouragement to do the hard analytic spade work without letting imperfect information make us analytic cowards. That we had to make a call and we had to keep learning and we had to keep trying. And I'm proud to call him a friend and a mentor and probably one of the most important influences on my life and how I think about China. So I want to jump into the first question about Hu Yaobang and who he was and why did you want to write about him? Because to the extent that Americans know who Hu Yaobang is, we remember him for his death and the memorial service that followed, and the sort of the students flocking to Tiananmen Square in Beijing Spring that culminated in the Tiananmen massacre on June 4th in 1989. So, who was Hu Yaobang, and why did you think it was important to go back and write about someone who you probably covered quite a bit when you were at CIA?
Well, that's true. I did cover him. I was the branch chief for the domestic policy branch, and during the period from about 1983 to 87, 86, and that was sort of the apogee of Hu Yaobang's career. So I knew a lot about him, although I didn't use the material that was declassified, because I just didn't want it to get in the way of what I thought would be the real research in the Chinese language. Hu Yaobang was, this book about Hu Yaobang is in a sense a prequel to my earlier book that I wrote at Brookings, Beyond Tiananmen, The Politics of U.S. China Relations, 1989 to 2000. I gave some background about the political situation in Beijing at the time, and the volatility of the situation, the disagreements within the leadership and so forth, and that Hu Yaobang's death kind of catalyzed a lot of discontent, not only publicly amongst the populace, but also within the leadership. It was factionalized, divided into different groups. But I didn't really spend much time on Hu Yaobang himself, because he had died and he wasn't really part of the picture. So, but I knew that if I looked into his history a little bit more, I would have more understanding and insight into the political situation in Beijing in 1989 than I thought I did just to write that book. I didn't need to delve into it, and the materials, quite frankly, weren't really available. So the Hu Yaobang story was one of several that I proposed to the Smith Richardson Foundation. And surprisingly and happily, that's the one they chose for me to follow up on. That then consumed the next 10 years of my life as I was going through the genuine ocean of material that has come out about Hu Yaobang since his rehabilitation in 2005. And that became a story in and of itself. Hu Yaobang was an unusual man to be the preeminent leader, or one of the preeminent leaders of his generation. He was a Hakka peasant from eastern Hunan province, not far from where Mao was born and raised. He never changed his name. He didn't go to a fancy school or a military academy or get sent to Paris to work, in support of other communist movements. He grew up as a peasant. And because his schooling was interrupted, and he was a brilliant student, very promising student, because his schooling was interrupted by marauding warlords in the 1920s, he eventually, and because his family, his parents and his brother, had kind of become active in communist activities in and around Luoyang, which is the largest city near his hometown. He then got himself involved in sort of children's corps stuff, But when he was 14 years old, uh, none of the schools were able to open up in and around Hunan, including Changsha, where he went. And he finally decided he probably already had a price on his head, so he went up to Qingangshan. He had seen Mao on his way through the city where his middle school was located, and thought he was a pretty classy guy, pretty impressive leader. So he went up and joined first the Youth League and then the Communist Party in the early 30s, and went on the Long March, had a horrible time, was shot, was sick, and was starving. Finally struggled into Yan'an in 1935, and then he became an acolyte of Chairman Mao because they spoke the same dialect, and because Hu Yaobang was a very curious and ardent student and was looking for some kind of a hero. And he latched onto Mao, and Mao saw his talents and abilities and put him to work fairly early in the school administration and then in the Central Military Commission, where he met up with Ye Jianying, who would be his mentor and benefactor throughout his life. And sort of that's how he got his start in the revolution. And he rose. He kind of came in and out of favor with Mao because he didn't always agree with what Mao was doing. And of course, the Yan'an period, if you get a chance to read Gao Hua's book, was really where Mao developed his methodologies and ideology and leadership styles that would characterize his reign at the top of the Communist Party of China. And that's where he first became chairman and general secretary. So Hu was along for the ride, but he was also very competent and capable and smart. And Mao recognized that in him immediately.
So one of the things that's interesting reading about Hu Yaobang's life is that he seemed to generate genuine affection, even among people that didn't like him politically.
Hmm.
And, you know, it's kind of that presidential campaign question of like, is this someone you'd like to have a beer with, or in his case, really smoke a pack of cigarettes with? Uh,
He was
so
a heavy
what
smoker.
what what did he have going for him that made him um, that made him generate that affection?
Well, when you think about sort of leadership, the presence that a leader has, he didn't have any of that. He was 5 feet tall, 100 pounds, had a very high, kind of almost squeaky voice with a very heavy Hunan accent. So he wasn't the kind of person that you would pick out of a lineup and say that guy's going to go far. But he was intelligent, enthusiastic, well-read, and he listened to people. He wasn't just out there to hear the sound of his own voice. He wanted to know what people thought. He wanted to organize what they did so that they were all more effective. He was apparently, once you got by the accent, which is pretty hard. I won't lie about it. That I listened to one of his speeches and I thought, man, I know what I'm doing wrong, but was he doing right? But in any case, he was inspirational. His enthusiasm and his uprightness, his honesty, his loyalty were all signal characteristics of the personality that he developed into as a member of the Communist Party, and the people that he was with. Both he worked well both with his superiors and with his subordinates. His principal benefactors, unlike what I think most people probably believe, were Hua Guofeng and Ye Jianying, and not Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping didn't meet with Hu Yaobang until the late 1940s, I think 1949, 1950, when they were both down in the southwest region where Deng was head of the regional party committee, and Hu Yaobang was, because of his talent and organizational abilities, was given charge of 1/4 of Sichuan province, 17 million people. That's not a small responsibility. So they got along well, but they weren't close. Um, Hu did as he was told. He sometimes didn't do things as um, deliberately cruel and barbarous as Deng Xiaoping wanted him to do, and Mao Zedong was cheering for him to do. But he did his provincial administration job well, and Deng couldn't fault him. So he went to Beijing with, not with Deng, but at the same time as Deng. And then he was given the Youth League assignment by Mao in 1952. And then that was his whole career for the next 10 years. But he was an accomplished speaker. He wrote all his own speeches. He didn't have stock speeches. He was active. He was almost. I had one American diplomat who had met him said he was like a. People tended to call him Cricket because of the high voice and because he just sort of was actively jumping up and down and standing up and waving his arms and he was a colorful act. And of course, Deng Xiaoping, even though they were about the same height, and Chen Yun as well, they were very staid and very conscious of the image that they projected. Hu Yaobang didn't really care about that. He just wanted to get things done and have people's lives better as a result of what the Communist Party was doing. So, and people caught that right away.
So one thing you mentioned, Hu being inspirational, and when we, to the extent that people think about Hu Yaobang, they think of him as a party bureaucrat, sort of maneuvering and organizing and moving the paper and appointing personnel. And uh, but he left Yan'an to go out into the field, and I'd be curious if you could explain a little bit about what he did and why that was important and how that reflects on the PLA. Because when you look at a lot of the people that the PLA holds up as their great leaders, they are not necessarily the battlefield commanders, but
Mhm.
are the political commissars. So can you tell us a little bit about Hu Yaobang's sort of military role when he sort of volunteered to go out and get
Sure.
away from headquarters?
Yeah, he was getting a little tired of Yan'an. He did volunteer, and the first person that he had hoped to work for was Lin Biao. But that didn't work out because the Kuomintang planted an army in his path, and he wasn't able to get up to the northeast. So he stayed in the North China area around west of Beijing and between Beijing and Taiyuan. He was a political commissar. Um, he already had some rank, so they put him in at a fairly high level at the corps level, which is sort of the brigade level. And as a political commissars are sort of part chaplain, part cheerleader, part teacher, uh, part just making everything work more successfully by making sure lines of communication are open, that policies are understood, that loyalties are gained and maintained. It's a job that we're generally not all that familiar with because we don't have political commissars in the U.S. Army. We have chaplains. Um, One of the things that became his responsibility as the war went on, and Hu Yaobang, even though he was occasionally allocated a horse, he preferred to walk along with the troops. And many of them, at least initially, were from the Jiangxi area, some of them from Hunan. But many were not, and many of them were, in fact, people who surrendered to the PLA, or they were called the PLA, to the Red Army during that period, and were immediately inducted into the army, the Chinese Red Army. So he was responsible for teaching them, indoctrinating them, maintaining their morale, and helping persuade them to go into battles, situations that were hopelessly, desperately bad for them. And the casualties in the area of his operations in North China were hellacious. Thousands so I mean these were World War I style battles with machine gun fire and artillery and high casualties, not much cover, attacking over walls of places like Shijiazhuang and Taiyuan. And so they lost a lot of troops, and he had to help try to maintain the loyalty of new people, and he also had to help his commanders and sub-commanders and other commissars do the work more effectively, and he was quite good at it.
So you also write in the introduction that the book is not a hagiography and that Hu Yaobang is no hero. And, as someone who lived through some of the most tumultuous events and circumstances that we saw in the 20th century and participated in them, I think you could say that another name for a hero would simply have been a martyr or perhaps in the communist sense, a rightist. Um, you know, what, you given that we've seen biographies of Deng Xiaoping and others kind of move into that sort of maybe not quite hero worship, but they've gone in that direction. Why why do you sort of state this so bluntly? Um,
Well, I try to. I mean, I didn't go. I did go to China and visited his gravesite and his home village and the headquarters for his Sichuan command. But I didn't talk to a lot of people because that was, and Ezra Vogel and I were both working on the same biography. And he was much better at that sort of thing than I am, including both in language and in knowledgeability of people who were in the business of historical writing. So I had to rely on the books that were available. And although there were and are in traditional CCP manner, there were a lot of hagiographies about Hu Yaobang. And there were things that were covered up or went unsaid that I had to kind of dig around in various sorts of literature to find. For example, that he joined the Central Social Department when he was in Yan'an, worked for Kang Sheng, that he whitewashed his own report about the catastrophic death counts in the Great Leap Forward. He stopped on his way from Anhui province back to Beijing, and he basically rewrote the report so that it would be more acceptable to Mao. That's not a particularly honorable thing to do, but it doesn't surprise me because, I mean, he had no desire to be a martyr or a rightist, and that was easy to become during that period. So I tried to find a balance point between his very stubborn and open desire to tell the truth and the political demands that emerged from the society that he was in and the political situation in which he found himself. So he was, I think, above all to his own self, true. And even though he didn't always do what he wanted to do, even when he made a mistake, he always regretted it. And in fact, with respect to that report to Mao, after the Great Leap Forward and after Mao had died, he went back to Anhui province and apologized. He looked for the people that he had talked to when he was there, who told him that 6 million people in Anhui had died. And he went back to them and said, I am so sorry. You were right. I knew it, but I couldn't give the report the way you would have accepted it. So, I mean, he didn't lie to himself very much. And he didn't lie all that much to anybody else, but he wasn't, I mean, he didn't have the stature. Guys 5 feet tall, I know about those guys. You don't stand up to bullies really much. You find somebody that can help you get away from them. And it wasn't that he was cowardly, not in the slightest, or was he always apologetic for the mistakes that he knew that Mao was making. But he had to find that balance between self-preservation and doing the job as best he could. And for the most part, I think he succeeded. But I mean, I openly stated in the introduction to the book that as a reformer, he was a failure because he wasn't able to break the grip on absolute power that was held by, certainly not by Mao or nor by Deng. They were too strong for him, and he knew that standing up and and criticize them to their face or whatever was the way to, instant self-destruction. So he didn't do it, even though he eventually ended up paying the price for it. His decentness after the Ninth Party Congress.
It is noticeable that you call him the conscience of the party. As I recall in one of the review comments or questions, I think was when did Hu Yaobang find his conscience?
Yeah.
Um, I think
Uh,
but the question I want to ask on this is, if he was a part of the Central Social Affairs Department at Yan'an, he was one of the perpetrators of some incredibly vicious purges.
mhm.
Working under Deng Xiaoping in the Southwest, right? It's really the bloodiness of the suppression of Sichuan that Frank DeCotter highlighted as the tragedy of liberation.
Yep.
I mean, there were other excesses, but he was involved in two of the early excesses of the party. And then he became a victim of them in the Cultural Revolution. And I'm curious how do you think he learned from from those experiences, both as sort of the perpetrator of those excesses and then as a victim, and how did this shape what he wanted to do with the party going into the 1980s when he was finally in a
Yeah.
position of real seniority?
Those are good questions, and I'm not sure I can give you a very full answer to them. But he tried Deng Xiaoping in Sichuan was just bloodthirsty. Uh, they bragged about 800,000 uh, rightists, not rightists, but counter-revolutionaries and five bad elements and so forth. There were a lot of Kuomintang and revolution and Kuomintang army people that ended up in the Southwest. And a scholar named Yang Hui-sung wrote some papers about that in the early part of the century, and admits and advertises that most of them were killed. No trial or anything; they were just taken out and shot. Hu Yaobang did some of that during the campaign against bandits. There was a Genfan campaign against bandits, and his part of Sichuan province killed between 40 and 70,000 people in a relatively short period of time. So he was no stranger to that kind of violence. The party, I mean, Mao was demanded it and monitoring it. So there was no way to avoid it if you wanted to stay in those jobs. Later on, there were also times when during the anti-rightist campaign, when he was required to purge the youth league, and he did this with, at least according to his biographers, who may have exaggerated it, he did this with lots of complaints. And he tried to save people, and he just never had the chance. They told him, you either take those people down or we'll take them down, and we'll take you along with them. So he did things that he knew were the wrong things to do, but he did them because he wanted to stay as part of what he thought was a party that could make things better. Did it cost him? Certainly did. Probably the worst time of his life was in the Cultural Revolution, when they had, dangled Ninth Central Committee membership to him, but he had to abase himself in front of Kang Sheng and Jiang Qing. Even though Mao continued to support him, they said, this guy doesn't have the heart or soul for this, so we're not going to bring him into the Ninth Central Committee. And because he had criticized both of them, and he wrote this long letter to Mao about the imperfections of the economic system that they had inherited from the Soviet Union. That letter has never been fully released because I think at one point Hu actually said something like, I've never understood this notion of the unending class struggle. So Mao, if he read it, he probably didn't take it very well. And so 2 weeks after the Ninth Congress ended, Hu Yaobang was out in Henan in one of the worst of the prison labor camps, the 571 farms, and he spent the next 2+ years out there. And I think even though he didn't have the time to do much thinking. In the period between 1969 and 1972, he was simply forced to give everything he had to survival, and to living in an atmosphere where cruelty was the rule, discipline was the requirement, keeping your mouth shut was absolutely essential. After he got back in 1972, they still didn't give him a job. So he spent the time in his house, in his home, um, reading and thinking, smoking, reading, thinking, smoking. And I think I can't tell you what he thought because he never wrote it down. But in terms of the activities that he undertook in the period from 1977 to the end of his life, really, um, he was the guy that was trying to help the underdogs, and to try to correct the mistakes that had been made both in ideology and in policy, and was able to, he wasn't always in favor, but he tried his best to do that. And I can only guess that the punishment that he received during the Cultural Revolution from the multiple beatings, and absolute mistreatment from Red Guards in his headquarters, to the witnessing and participation in all of these crazy activities, and watching the party basically dissolve itself, and watching Mao Zedong become increasingly crazy. I think he put the pieces together and basically concluded that this party cannot be fixed. Uh, and 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 he tried to do his best to undo the damage that he saw around him everywhere. So did he have a conscience? Yes. Did he have it before the Cultural Revolution? Yes, but not anywhere near as strong.
So you mentioned this effort to fix. And when he became party general secretary under Deng Xiaoping and was there in the 1980s, what was he what was he doing in that from that position? Given that it was a constrained position, there's still the party elders around that are exercising incredible informal authority, including the retired head of the All China Bridge Federation. Um,
Important, powerful position.
but how, what was he trying to fix, and how was he trying to move the party when he was nominally at its head?
Yeah. Well, the things for which he gets the most credit um, were the things that he began early when he was working for Hua Guofeng and Ye. And his priorities, he first went to the party school in 1977. And one, they wanted him to start classes again because they'd been closed since 1966. The PLA had taken over the campus, and the professors were there, but they weren't doing anything. So he basically was given that task, but he also devoted himself to fixing the ideology, because he put together this theoretical publication, which ran every couple of weeks, and put out very erudite and well-reasoned discussions of classical Marxist ideology. And he managed to get this out of the hands of the propaganda department, and low circulation to the leaders of the party. And they addressed some of these questions, especially they were particularly prolific before Central Committee meetings, when they got the word out. And the questions that he was asking was, why did we have a cultural revolution? Why did it last for 10 years? How did the Gang of Four get so powerful? And why was it so difficult to stop it? And he was challenging his students, and many of them were senior cadre, to address those questions. And he's challenging his ideology faculty to come up with the answers. They didn't do very well, but he kept at it. The next job he had was as head of the organization department. And he wanted to follow through on his pledge, to redress the grievances that had accumulated during the Cultural Revolution. Pardon me here a minute. and he did it with enthusiasm and a lot of support from his organization department staff, whom he inspired with his work ethic. And they released or redressed the grievances on something like 500,000 Communist Party cadres who were purged during the Cultural Revolution and before. So he was working on that. Then they put him in the propaganda department, and he went straight to work again on the ideological questions and to try to undo or repair the mare's nest that the propaganda department had become of sort of feuding satrapies of people that wouldn't talk to each other. I mean, it was a mess, and he started in on that. But the first thing he did was to organize a bunch of intellectuals to come and talk about the Cultural Revolution. And we've never seen the accounts of those meetings because they just unloaded on Mao. I mean, they were angry people who had been purged and punished and mistreated, and they all jumped up and waved their hands and pointed their fingers at Mao. And Hu Yaobang was so appalled that these long-standing party ideologists would do that, because Hu Yaobang himself was a hardline Maoist, and he was Deng's principal speechwriter. And he went to Deng Xiaoping after he got back from the United States in 1979 and said, "You got to stop this. You know, we're going to lose the party here." And Deng, who was not what you'd call an ideological heavyweight, listened to Hu Yaobang, and he basically put the kibosh on that meeting in 1979 with his speech on the four upholds. He said, "These you can't talk about these subjects and criticize them. Role of the party, role of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, the importance of Mao Zedong thought," and I can never keep these straight, but he basically, and Hu Yaobang was chastised and disappeared for a while, had to do self-criticism for allowing that kind of thing, and he never really recovered from it, because the left wing of the party, Hu Yaobang and Deng Liqun, saw him as vulnerable, and they never let him rest for the rest of his career. He became the general secretary, and from there graduated to secretary. I'm sorry, he was secretary general, graduated to general secretary, and left the propaganda department without having fulfilled his desires. But Deng was still a supporter, and they put together what they called the what's the carriage in the Russian, anyway, the three, not the three body problem, it was the Deng Hu Jiao system. And that was quite effective at running the government for the next couple of years. So he survived his brush with fate, and Hu Yaobang could never really lay a glove on him after that. Sorry, I went on too long. You can edit this.
No, not at all. I think you had called Hu a failed reformer, and you've pointed out some successes, some failures, and when you look at where sort of biographies of Deng Xiaoping have focused, they focused almost entirely on the 1980s and the reform era, and again, sort of this push of saying, look, here was this massive change. Deng Xiaoping drove it. And in researching and writing this book, how did this change your appraisal of Deng and the 1980s, right? Because especially given that you were working right through it in a period of time in the United States, probably to have one of the best perches that you could have had to see this as it was unfolding from the outside.
Well, I mean, it wasn't until I began the research on Hu Yaobang that I discovered that probably the most important of the economic reforms that was accomplished by the party in the 1980s was rural reform. The dismantlement of the communist system that had been responsible for the enormous death toll during the Great Leap Forward, and was the hated creature the hated overseer of the peasantry. And it took him 4 years to accomplish it. He started in 1980 with the help of Wan Li, and several other people. But he never had the full support of Deng Xiaoping until he was able to get it put together piecemeal in various parts of China. And by 1984, the agricultural system was doing so well that they said, well, this is it. We're done with the communes. And that was an enormous achievement. This is 600 million people that became better in a very short period of time, and Hu Yaobang gets a lot of credit for that. He wasn't quite so successful in other areas. First of all, Chen Yun resented him for even speaking about the economy. Zhao Ziyang, who was put in charge of the economy in 1981, always grumbled about Hu Yaobang saying things about the economy, and Deng Xiaoping had to pull him up short on a couple of occasions because he really wanted to just charge forward, and the rest of these guys were still wedded to what they knew best, which was the Soviet style managed economy. So he was able to bring about a lot of changes, but a lot of the things that he did sort of pioneer got put on ice. And when Deng Xiaoping came back after Tiananmen, after Hu's death, he pirated a lot of the ideas that Hu Yaobang had initiated and brought them to bear in the special economic zones, the freedom of economic planning and so forth that he is given credit for were originally ideas that Hu Yaobang had developed but had to drop because of Deng's opposition. And I think that's something that not a lot of people, and some people probably aren't going to agree with my arguments on this subject, but I believe that Deng was not the brightest candle in the candelabra, but when you wanted to get something done, he was your guy because he knew how to push people around. He knew how to threaten them, to motivate them. He knew how to draw together different interests within the party, and he knew from whom and where and when to draw the best ideas that he could to improve the system. I mean, he talked about political reform. He talked about it in 1980 in a speech that everybody thinks was the origin of political reform, but it wasn't. He dropped it like a hot rock, and they didn't really get it back around to it until after the 13th Congress, when they had tried some political reforms that failed miserably, and he began to sort of try it again in different ways. But again, these were ideas that Hu Yaobang had not pioneered because he didn't really make them work either, but they were attributed to him, and he was considered to be this person who always wanted comprehensive reform that included and didn't exclude political reform from the equation.
So, to bring us back a little bit to the present, because I think this book has some remarkable insights and especially into the Communist Party and how it operates. About 12 and a half years ago, you gave a speech at the annual Jamestown China Defense and Security Conference, and you presented 20 theses in your short speech, if you will, about us watching China, and about the Chinese Communist Party. And number 15 was it's still communist. Number 16 was that domestic politics are paramount. And number 19 was that the regime does not wish foreign or domestic observers to really understand what's going on. And I'd be curious, since you gave that speech, a few months before you started working on the proposal and putting this project together, I'd be curious how your experience working on this book, um, you know, would cause you to reflect on those three points.
Well, they're all still true. Um, they're all still relevant, and they are probably part of the larger picture of why reform has died in China. Um, I mean, that's probably. I mean, many people will say, "Oh, that's an overstatement," and you shouldn't say that. But as a matter of fact, if you look at what has been accomplished under Xi Jinping, um, there's not much that you could honestly look at and say, oh, that's a reform. People call it reforms. And when they evaluated the third plenum in June, I think they bandied that word about a bit. But in fact, the party is not suited to bring about reform in any way that changes its hold on power. They are ideologically rigid. They are culturally fully accustomed to and demanding the continuation of their iron grip on power. And they don't want their people or us to know how thoroughly that system is exactly the same as it was 40, 50 years ago. I mean, Xi Jinping is more like Mao than Hu Jintao was, for example. He is basically from the start of his regime in 2012. He basically, I quote a speech in the last chapter of my book that I'm not sure is actually legitimate, but seems to have some believability with what Xi Jinping has done. He essentially said, "Don't expect reform from me. It's too hard. We tried it before; it didn't work, and I'm not going to let the party try it again." So they put a lot of roadblocks in the way, both in terms of the restrictions on public expression of speech and also on the writing of their own history. It has become extraordinarily difficult to find the sources that I used when I was working on this book in 2014, 2015, 2016. The system was just at that point kind of gradually tightening its grip, closing down magazines and websites. Now that process has been almost fully achieved, and you simply they closed down the Hu Yaobang website, and I don't know, they had plenty of reasons to do so, because there were still articles that were being published there that were not in line with official ideology. They wanted to have constitutional government. They wanted to have freedom of speech. And Xi Jinping just closed them down and finally just couldn't stand it, even though the damage to Hu Yaobang's reputation by the closing down of his website is probably still being felt. The thing that the Communist Party does better than anything else is discipline. And that's the only way that I can explain some of the decisions that were made by Hu Yaobang to back away from some issues, and certainly by Deng Xiaoping by allowing Chen Yun to have a heavy degree of influence on economic policies. Zhao Ziyang complained about this all the time, but he also couldn't do anything that was outside of what he considered to be his proper disciplinary role. So whatever it is that they have built into the system and into the party's culture are operative on everybody. And so nobody has the courage to stand up and speak truth to power, because and I think that is one of the principal reasons why that party has been unable to sustain any degree of public or popular reform.
One last question, because you've covered a lot of ground and a lot of party history and developments that you, in some cases, seen in our lifetimes. When we're looking at the debate in the United States now about what did we get right, what did we get wrong on China policy, a number of people in your generation, people who had served in the 80s and the 90s and 2000s, all say, well, no, we had our eyes wide open. We knew exactly the nature of the CCP and the regime. And it feels like as we've had our conversations throughout your research of this book, that your view has changed, in some cases hardened. Um, about your views on the party. And I was curious, how to what extent would you do you think that we understood this, that we were engaging with China with our eyes wide open, with a clear understanding of who the party was and who its leadership was? And if you knew now, if you knew then what you know now from this project, how do you think that might have changed some of the way that you approach your thinking, from perhaps putting a little less sarcasm in some of your NSC memos?
Yeah. Policymaking is a complicated and multifaceted process. And one of the hardest things for me to learn was that my voice was only one among many. It was smaller than many others, and that I would not necessarily prevail even if I was right. One of the other things that I have learned in my research is that the Chinese system is every bit as complicated and divided and hard to understand when you get close to it and look at it carefully, as ours is. People make bad decisions. They make stupid decisions on both sides of the Pacific. And one of the hardest things I remember from being an analyst that you could explain was a mistake. Because your sort of assumption is these people have been, communists for a long time. They must know what they're doing. But the fact of the matter is that the more, particularly in economic policy, the more I read, the more I sort of scratched my head and said, what are they doing? And why? And whose interests are being served by some of these things? But that was never anything that I could, walk into the president's office and say, sir, we've got a problem here. We need to change our approach. The whole policy set that we've adopted is off center and not accurate. Because I couldn't say that with any degree of confidence, because I really didn't know then what I have discovered since then.
Now we're good, I think.
I didn't know at the time that there was the degree of disagreement, factional infighting, and I mean these guys really don't like each other in the CCP. They have this showdown culture in which power gravitates toward the top, and people who are down below are constantly trying to figure out some way to undo that or to replace them. So it really is it's a kind of a it is a you die I live kind of culture that predominates there. We didn't know that, and we didn't try to think of ways to take advantage of it. We were always trying to put together a policy that worked inside the United States, that the business community could accept human rights. Activists could at least allow it to go without throwing things at it. That all of the elements that make up the American policy system could live with and could agree upon. So what was actually going on inside the PRC was only one of several important factors that we had to that we considered in terms of making policy. And because our understanding of what was going on inside the PRC was so flawed, because they didn't want it to be not flawed, that we sort of were always groping around in the dark to try and put together a policy that was workable. By contrast, the PRC has an iron clad system where differences of view are not tolerated, where one person often will be the spokesperson for all foreign policy issues. They all memorize their lines and they say the same thing. So we're operating in different policy-making milieu, and we're at a disadvantage. I mean, that's the only thing I can say that that can explain it. I hope we can do better as things roll forward. I hope that we can find some way to manage the relationship with Xi Jinping in ways that we haven't done for the last several years. But it ain't easy. The party has not changed, the culture has not changed, and the structure in which that party operates is identical to the way it was when Mao was there. Not promising.
It's a good silent plug for your book, Beyond Tiananmen, U.S. China Relations, 1989 to 2000, because I think it still is one of the best sort of memoirs of policy, in part because you include the personal experience, but you also try to analyze what was going on in the United States and what was going on inside the PRC to help us understand how these two systems were interacting with each other. And it still is probably one of the most refreshingly honest policy memoirs of any time, really. But thank you for joining us this morning to discuss the conscience of the party. I think this is truly a remarkable and impressive work, and it's the kind of thing that will give you a different perspective on the party and all of the sort of ugliness that Bob alluded to, and the factionalism and the players and the personalities. I think in a way that a lot of histories and a lot of writing on the party just don't do. So thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, Peter, for hosting this very, very good session. Liked it.